She smirked and said, "You're the kind of man women settle for, not the kind they desire." I quietly left that evening. 11 months later, she accidentally walked into a restaurant and found me hosting a celebration surrounded by people she always wanted to impress. "You're the kind of man women settle for, not the kind they actually desire." She said it the way people say things they've been holding for a long time. Not with rage, not with tears, with the calm precision of someone filing a document they've already decided on. I was standing in the kitchen. I remember that detail because I'd been holding a mug of coffee, her favorite blend, the one I'd started buying because she mentioned once, maybe a year ago, that she liked it. And when those words landed, I just stood there, mug in hand, steam curling between us like it didn't know what else to do. I didn't say anything, not because I had nothing to say, because there were too many things, and none of them felt adequate. And somewhere in the back of my mind a strange, cold voice whispered that anything I said right now would only confirm what she'd just said about me. So I stood there and felt it. Felt the particular sting of words that land not because they're cruel, but because some part of you, the part you've been arguing with for months, the part you've been drowning in work and plans and small improvements, wonders if they're true. Settle for. That was the phrase that did it. Not desire. I understood desire was a word about electricity, about pull, about something instinctive. But settle, that word carried weight. That word meant she had looked at me, measured me against some internal standard I didn't know existed, and concluded that I was what someone chose when they couldn't do better. The mug was warm in my hands. The kitchen smelled like coffee and the faint trace of whatever candle she'd burned the night before. Sandalwood, I think. I set the mug down on the counter. Carefully. No noise. "Okay," I said. Just that. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Surprise, maybe, that I hadn't fought back. Or disappointment. Or maybe she was looking for something to confirm what she already believed, and my silence was doing exactly that. I walked to the bedroom. I got my jacket. I walked to the front door. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Out," I said. And I left. I didn't realize it then. Standing on the sidewalk in November, no destination, just the cold air and the city noise, and that mug of coffee sitting untouched on her counter. But that moment changed everything. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. Let me tell you about how it was before all that. Because it wasn't always that kitchen, that silence, that word. There was a version of us that was genuinely good. I met Suzanne at a mutual friend's rooftop party in June, 3.5 years before that November evening. She was wearing a yellow dress and arguing with someone about a film, confidently, specifically, with citations, and I thought, I want to talk to that person. I'm not someone who crosses rooms easily. I'm more the type to watch from a comfortable distance and convince myself the conversation would have been awkward anyway. But something about the way she held her ground made me want to try. We talked for 2 hours. Just the two of us, in a corner of that rooftop, while everyone else did the thing parties do around people who found a pocket of real conversation. She was a marketing strategist. Sharp, funny, with a way of reframing things that made ordinary observations feel like discoveries. I was working in operations at a mid-sized logistics company, not glamorous, but steady, and I was good at it. I told her what I did, and she didn't gloss over it the way people sometimes do when they're unimpressed. She asked follow-up questions. Real ones. We went on 4 dates before we held hands and 6 before I kissed her, because I wanted to be sure, and she later told me that's what she liked about me. That I wasn't in a hurry. That I seemed to actually want to know her. For about 2 years, that was true of both of us. Stuart, my best friend since college, who'd moved to Brooklyn the same year I did, liked her immediately, which meant something to me. Stuart has a built-in detector for people who are performing versus people who are real, and he'd learned to trust it after a string of questionable friendships in his 20s. He told me, early on, that Suzanne was the real kind. She actually laughs, he said, as if this were rare. For the people he'd been around, maybe it was. She and I used to spend Sundays cooking elaborate, unnecessary meals. Not because either of us was a particularly skilled cook, but because we'd decided, somewhere in the early months, that we'd teach ourselves together. We'd pick a cuisine, Ethiopian one week, Taiwanese the next, and spend 3 hours in her kitchen making a mess and eating something that was usually about 60% as good as we'd hoped. We kept a list on the fridge. Little stars next to the ones that worked. She wanted to eventually move somewhere with more space. I wanted to build something that mattered at work and have room to think. We talked about these things as shared goals rather than competing ones, which is either a sign of a good relationship or a sign that you haven't yet gotten specific enough to find where you differ. I think, looking back, it was some of both. Neil was in our orbit during this period, a mutual friend who'd introduced us, in a roundabout way, by throwing that rooftop party. He was gregarious and scattered and worked in tech sales, and he had a habit of showing up with 2 bottles of wine when one would have been fine and staying 2 hours after most people left. I liked him. He was good company in the way that certain people are good company. Easy to be around, low stakes, reliably himself. There was one Sunday when Suzanne and I had failed spectacularly at a Moroccan stew. It was fine, technically edible, but not what we'd aimed for. And she'd looked at the pot with this expression of mock betrayal and said, completely serious, "I feel like the lentils lied to us," and I'd laughed so hard I had to sit down. That's the kind of thing that binds people, not grand gestures. I should tell you that there were small things, even then. Not red flags, exactly. More like faint signals I noticed, and then put away, the way you sometimes hear a sound in an old building and decide it's nothing because everything else seems fine. Once, at a dinner party, someone asked what I did and Suzanne answered before I could. The answer was accurate. The speed of it was just slightly strange. Once, after I'd gotten a small recognition at work, not a promotion, just a note in a company-wide email about a process I'd streamlined, she said, "That's nice," and returned to her phone, which is a thing people do, which I remembered, for some reason. Once, when I'd suggested we look at an apartment in a quieter neighborhood in Queens, she'd said, "I just want to make sure we're not settling," and I'd nodded and said, "Of course," and we'd kept looking, and neither of us mentioned it again. Small things. Nothing that required action. I put them in the drawer where you put things you'll deal with later, and went back to the Sunday cookouts and the list on the fridge and the 2 years that were genuinely, substantially good. Kirk entered the picture on a Saturday in late spring of year 3. He was Tamara's boyfriend, Tamara being one of Suzanne's closer friends, a woman who worked in PR and curated her life the way she curated her clients' public images, which is to say carefully and with obvious intent. Tamara had mentioned Kirk before. Kirk this, Kirk that. A finance guy who'd recently made partner somewhere significant. Ran marathons. Had an apartment in Tribeca that Tamara described the way travel writers describe places they want you to envy. We met him at a dinner Tamara hosted in that Tribeca apartment. It was the kind of place that functions as its own argument. High ceilings, one enormous abstract painting, kitchen island the size of my first New York studio. The kind of place that says, someone made decisions here, and those decisions were correct. Kirk was tall in the way that certain men carry rooms without trying. Not aggressive about it. Just present. He had the ease of someone who'd never had to wonder whether he was welcome, and there's a particular confidence that comes from that. Not arrogance, exactly, but a settled quality, like he'd already done the math on himself and come out satisfied. He shook my hand and was genuinely warm. That was the part nobody tells you to prepare for. He wasn't a villain. He was just impressive in a way that made the room organize itself around him without anyone planning it. Jill was there too, Suzanne's other close friend, sharp and observant in a way she deployed selectively. She'd always been pleasant to me, but the kind of pleasant that's careful, that keeps its options open. I watched the evening unfold. Not with suspicion, not at first. Just the normal background attention of a person at a dinner party, reading the room, figuring out the dynamics. What I noticed was this: Suzanne, who in our daily life was the confident one, the one who walked into rooms and found her footing immediately, became a slightly different person around Kirk. Not flirtatious. Nothing so obvious. More like she turned the volume up on herself. Laughed a little brighter. Made her opinions more declarative. Told a story about a campaign she'd managed with more precision and detail than she usually bothered with. She wanted him to think well of her. That wasn't, by itself, a crisis. People adjust themselves around people they find impressive. I probably did too. What I couldn't quite name, driving home that night, was the particular quality of her attention toward him. The way it was different from the attention she gave the rest of the table, including me. "He seems like a good guy," I said, "somewhere on the Manhattan Bridge." "He's very successful," she said. Not yes, he does. Not I guess. Just that. An acknowledgement of the attribute that mattered. I looked at the river. Let it go. The next few social outings with that group followed a similar pattern. Kirk would say something about markets or real estate or a trip he'd taken, and there'd be this small gravitational shift in the room. Not dramatic, not exclusive, but present. and Suzanne would be near that gravitational center, laughing or engaging or nodding, and I'd be slightly to the side of it, doing what I usually did at parties, which was talk to one person for a long time and feel intermittently guilty about not circulating. One evening at a bar, Kirk and I actually had a good conversation about operations and supply chain. He had opinions, informed ones, and seemed interested in mine. I left thinking, I like this person. This is not the problem. But I also noticed, walking to the subway with Suzanne afterward, that she'd been quiet in a particular way. A charged way. You and Kirk seem to hit it off, she said. He knows a lot about logistics, actually. She nodded. Then, he's the kind of person who just does things, you know? Like, he just goes after what he wants. I thought about asking what that implied about me. I didn't. Yeah, I said. You can tell. Later that night, getting ready for bed, she made a comment, casual, almost throwaway, about how some people seem to build things while other people just maintain them. She said it about no one in particular. About types. About general observations. I brushed my teeth and went to sleep and told myself I was overthinking. Over the following months, something in the architecture of us shifted. Not in any single seismic event. More like what happens to a building in a climate that changes gradually. Small stresses in the structure, tiny separations at the joints. Nothing that triggers immediate alarm, but everything that suggests, to someone paying close attention, that the load-bearing assumptions are no longer as sound as they once were. Suzanne's small criticisms became more frequent. The delivery changed too, less the blunt honesty I'd always found attractive, more a kind of sighing disappointment, as if I were a project that kept failing to meet spec. She suggested I should network more, which was fair enough, except she said it in the tone of someone who's given up expecting the suggestion to land. She mentioned, twice in 1 week, that Kirk had given Tamara a watch for her birthday that cost more than my monthly rent. I didn't ask why this was being mentioned. I understood why it was being mentioned. There was a Saturday afternoon when I'd spent 3 hours fixing a problem with the apartment, a persistent leak under the bathroom sink that the landlord had been ignoring for weeks. I'd watched 3 videos, bought the right parts, fixed it. I was fairly proud of this. When Suzanne came home and I showed her, she nodded. Good, she said. And then, though we should probably be in a place where we can afford to just call someone for that. I let that one sit for a moment. Then I cleaned up the tools and put them away. I was, during this period, genuinely trying. I'd started waking up early, not dramatically, not as a performance, but because I'd been listening to a podcast about business and it was making me think about my career differently. I'd begun reading again, actually finishing books rather than abandoning them after 50 pages. I'd suggested to my manager that I could take on a cross-functional project that had been floating without an owner, and he'd said yes, and it was going well. None of this registered with Suzanne in any visible way. What she noticed was the things I hadn't done, that I hadn't pushed harder for a promotion, that I hadn't taken the evening finance course she'd suggested months ago, that I hadn't reached out to a contact she'd mentioned once, offhandedly, who worked at a firm she admired. I had a version of this conversation 3 or 4 times, always arriving at the same place. Me explaining what I was doing, her asking why I wasn't doing more, me getting quiet, her getting tired of my quiet. I just feel like you're comfortable, she said one evening. Like you've decided this is enough. I'm building something, I told her. It just doesn't look like what you think it should look like yet. She was quiet for a moment. Then, that's what people say when they're rationalizing standing still. I remember going for a long walk that night. Called Stuart, who listened with the specific patience of a person who wants to say I told you, and is choosing not to. She's comparing you to a template, he said. And the template isn't you. Maybe the template is better, I said, half joking. The template doesn't know how to fix a sink. I laughed. And then I went home, and Suzanne was asleep, and I lay next to her in the dark and had one of those middle-of-the-night feelings that I'd failed at something fundamental. Not professionally, not financially, but at the more basic task of being the kind of person that someone wants to look at and feel lucky. There was one evening, a few weeks before everything broke, that felt like the old version of us. A Tuesday, nothing special. She'd had a hard day at work, and I'd made dinner. Nothing complicated, just pasta, but done well. And we'd sat on the couch and watched a documentary about coral reef restoration, and she'd fallen asleep against my shoulder. I didn't move for 2 hours because I didn't want to wake her. That was the last time things felt the way they used to. Looking back, I think we were both pretending by then. She was pretending she could talk herself back into what she wanted to feel. I was pretending that the distance was temporary, that the right gesture or the right growth or the right Tuesday evening pasta could close a gap that had become structural. The argument that ended us didn't announce itself as the final one. It started in the way most significant arguments start, sideways, as something small. I'd been passed over for a promotion at work. Not dramatically. There was no public humiliation, no real crisis. My manager explained that the other candidate had more years of tenure, that I was being kept in mind for the next cycle, that my cross-functional work had been genuinely valued. Standard corporate language that translated to, not yet, but keep going. I came home and told Suzanne. I watched her face do something. It wasn't cruelty, exactly. It was the expression of a person having a private thought they decide not to quite voice. A small retraction, a reassessment. The face of someone updating a calculation. So what happens now? She asked. I keep doing the work. It'll come around. When? I don't know. Next cycle, apparently. She nodded slowly. Okay. I repeated. And then, because the air felt charged, are you upset? She looked at me for a long moment. I'm tired, she said. Not upset. Tired. Of what? And that was the opening. She'd been standing at that door for a while, I think, waiting for a large enough gap to walk through. We went around for 20 minutes. Not screaming, we were never screamers. Just talking in the way people talk when they've both been waiting and neither is willing to flinch first. She said she felt like we were stalled. I said we weren't stalled, we were building. She said building and stalling could look identical from where she was standing. I said maybe she was standing in the wrong place. It went like that. Sentences that started as conversation and landed as evidence. And then there was a pause. One of those long ones that has its own gravity. And she said it. You're the kind of man women settle for. Not the kind they actually desire. I have thought about this sentence, in the months since, more times than I can count. What I eventually understood about it is that it wasn't spontaneous. You don't say something that precise by accident. Those words had been assembled, probably over weeks or months. In whatever private space, she kept her truest assessments of things. It was the sentence that lived beneath all the smaller sentences. The thesis. I stood very still. I don't know exactly how long the silence lasted. Long enough that she shifted her weight. Long enough that the city outside continued making its city sounds. A cab, someone's music, a door somewhere. Okay, I said. Again. Just that. That's all you have to say? I don't know what else there is. She shook her head. This is exactly what I mean. I nodded once. Slowly. And then I went to the bedroom. Got my jacket. My keys. My wallet. Came back to the living room, where she was standing with her arms crossed. I need some air, I said. You always just leave, she said. Instead of staying and fixing it. I looked at her. Not with anger. I was surprised to find that what I felt wasn't anger, not primarily. It was something quieter and more permanent. A kind of closing. What happened after that surprised everyone, Stuart would say later, including me. I didn't go back to her apartment that night. I walked for 2 hours in the cold and ended up at a diner in Park Slope and ordered coffee and eggs and sat in a corner booth and thought about the word settle until it stopped feeling like a wound and started feeling like a direction. I stayed with Stuart for a week. Told him what happened. He listened, made me eat real food, and on the 4th day said, "What do you actually want?" Not in reaction to her. Just, what do you want? I thought about it for a real amount of time. Then I said, I want to build something that makes me proud. I want to be the kind of person who doesn't wonder. Okay, he said. Start there. The first 2 months were not cinematic. I was living in a sublet in Greenpoint, a small room in a 3-bedroom, which I'd found through a work acquaintance. And I was going to my job and coming home and sitting with the specific quiet of someone who's had a structural element removed and is learning to recalibrate without it. Suzanne and I had no dramatic final scene. We exchanged a few texts, practical things, the last of each other's belongings, and let the space grow until it was just space. I won't pretend I didn't miss her. I did. I missed the Sunday cooking and the documentary on the couch and the early version of her, the one in the yellow dress who had opinions about films. Missing that was legitimate. What I had to learn to separate from the missing was the question of whether she'd been right. I turned that question over like a stone for a while. And then I decided the more useful question was different. Who do I want to become? Russell came into my life through the cross-functional project at work. He was a senior operations consultant the company had brought in to evaluate our distribution infrastructure. Early 60s, came up through supply chain before making the move to consulting. The kind of person who'd accumulated enough context that they'd stopped needing to perform competence. It just was quietly and obviously. He came to 2 of our team meetings and said very little. On the 3rd, he asked me a question after the session ended. Just one question, about a process decision I'd made 6 months earlier that he'd found interesting. I explained my reasoning. He nodded slowly and said, "You see the whole system. Most people in your role only see their piece of it." I went home thinking about that. A week later, I asked him to get coffee. We talked for 3 hours. Over the following months, Russell became something like a mentor, not formally, not with that word, but functionally. He had a way of asking questions that required you to think before answering, which sounds simple, but isn't common. He pointed me toward books, toward people, toward ways of thinking about value creation that I'd been circling without quite reaching. I started a project outside of work. Small, a consulting framework for operational efficiency, aimed at mid-sized companies that couldn't afford big firms. It wasn't a business yet. It was a document, then a methodology, then a few conversations, then one actual engagement, a small Brooklyn manufacturing company that needed to streamline their inventory process. I charged them almost nothing. Did excellent work. They referred me to someone else. This is the part that doesn't make good footage for a highlight reel. The months when the work is real and the results are incremental and there's no clear sign of whether it's going anywhere. I had bad weeks. One stretch in early spring when 2 potential clients declined and I wondered if I'd misread my own capability. Russell told me, "Everyone who's building something goes through a period where the evidence is ambiguous. The difference between the ones who get through it and the ones who don't is what they do in the ambiguous period." I kept going. My physical self was also, quietly, changing. Not dramatically, I didn't transform. I started running in the mornings because it gave me an hour of useful thinking time, and also because I was tired of arriving at work already depleted. I started sleeping with real intention. I stopped eating badly not as discipline, but as preference, because I'd noticed I thought more clearly when I didn't. Paula I met at a co-working space in Dumbo where I'd started going to work on my side project. She was a brand strategist, independent, had left an agency 2 years earlier to go solo. We were at adjacent desks for 3 weeks before we had a real conversation. When we finally talked, over terrible coffee from the building's machine, she asked what I was working on with the directness of someone who was actually curious rather than politely filling silence. I told her. She asked good questions. I asked about her work. She was building something too, a practice, a reputation, an approach. We had the particular recognition of people who are both in the middle of something real. I did not think, sitting there with the bad coffee, this is a person I will fall for. I thought, this is someone I want to know better. We became friends over weeks of shared co-working space, occasional lunch, and the kind of conversation that builds slowly and has no agenda. She was funny in a dry, specific way. She was also clear-eyed in a way that wasn't harsh. She saw things without editorializing unnecessarily. I told her about Suzanne once, briefly. She listened and then said, "It sounds like you were both in a relationship with a version of the other person that was already becoming outdated." I thought about that for days. I heard about Suzanne intermittently, through Neil mostly, who stayed loosely in both of our orbits without quite choosing. Kirk and Tamara had broken up by December, about a month after Suzanne and I did, which I noted without drawing conclusions. Tamara had apparently discovered that Kirk's certainty about himself did not extend to certainty about her, and the relationship had ended in a way Tamara described to people as blindsiding, and that others, including Jill apparently, privately found less surprising. What I learned later, in pieces, was that Suzanne had moved closer to that social world after we separated. The world of Tamara and Jill and the people who orbited people like Kirk, events and openings and dinners in apartments with significant paintings. She'd spent several months, from what I could gather, in the pursuit of the kind of life she'd believed she'd been missing. What she found, apparently, was that the world she'd wanted to access looked different from the inside. The people in it were not more interesting. The conversations were not more meaningful. The men she encountered who matched the template she'd had in mind were often, up close, more concerned with the impression they made than the life they were actually living. Kirk himself she saw a few times, socially. They were pleasant to each other. There was a period, Neil suggested, when she may have hoped that something would develop. It didn't. Kirk was already with someone new, a woman who worked in venture capital, which Tamara reported with the specific disappointment of someone who'd expected to be that woman. What I learned later, and what recontextualized certain things for me, was that Suzanne had been struggling at work during the latter half of our relationship. A campaign she'd managed had underperformed significantly, and there'd been internal conversations about her trajectory. She hadn't told me. I don't know exactly why. Pride, maybe, or the fear that admitting professional vulnerability would change how I saw her, or the sense that our relationship wasn't the place she could bring that. When I understood this, something about those months shifted in my memory. The heightened attention to status, to Kirk's accomplishments, to my own perceived limitations. I read it differently. She'd been afraid. She'd been measuring everything against everything else because her own footing had gone uncertain, and measuring was a way of feeling oriented. That didn't undo what she'd said, but it made it more human. By spring, I heard through Neil that she'd had to pivot professionally, left the firm she'd been at, set up independently as a freelance consultant. It wasn't the graceful transition she might have wanted, but Neil said she was landing on her feet, which I believed, because Suzanne was genuinely talented. She just needed to remember that without the external scaffolding. Jill had apparently made a comment at some point to Tamara, who told Neil, who mentioned it to me with the discomfort of a man delivering information he's not sure he should be delivering. That Suzanne sometimes brought me up. That she'd say things like, he was actually doing something real, or I was wrong about what I was looking for. I took that information and put it somewhere quiet. It wasn't satisfying in the way you might expect. It was just sad in the way that realizations about things you can't undo tend to be. By month 8, my consulting work had grown into something I had to take seriously. I'd had 12 clients, real engagements, with real results, and 3 of them had referred me to others unprompted. Russell had made an introduction that led to a relationship with a mid-sized firm looking for fractional operational support, which became my most significant engagement yet. It wasn't a famous company. It wasn't a story people would tell at dinner parties. But the work was excellent and the results were measurable, and the people there respected what I brought. I moved into a proper apartment, 2 bedrooms in Carroll Gardens, enough room to have people over, enough quiet to think. I put nothing on the walls for the first 3 weeks because I wanted to choose right. Stuart came over for dinner when I'd finally furnished it. He walked around slowly, looking at the space, and then sat down at the table. You seem different, he said. Different how? Quieter. But not the bad kind. I knew what he meant. The noise I'd been living with, the low-frequency hum of am I enough? Am I what someone wants? Am I the kind of man who? That noise had gotten quieter. Not gone, but quieter. Manageable. Paula and I had moved from co-working acquaintances to something I could only call friendship, though by now it had the texture of something more, the kind of more that neither of us was rushing toward, because we'd both learned that rushing toward things was how you missed what they actually were. We went to a gallery opening in Bushwick one Friday and spent more time talking to each other than looking at the art. We took a long walk along the waterfront one Sunday in a conversation that went 3 hours without either of us noticing. She told me about the end of her last relationship, not with drama, but with the specificity of someone who'd done the work of understanding it. I told her about Suzanne. More this time. She listened. Then she said, it sounds like she was looking for someone to confirm that she was where she wanted to be. And when you couldn't confirm it, she blamed you for the doubt. I sat with that. Then I said, I think that's the most accurate thing anyone said about it. She looked out at the water. It's easy to see from the outside, she said. I've probably done it to people too. In different ways. I liked her enormously in that moment. The willingness to include herself in the observation. We hadn't said anything about what we were to each other. I didn't feel pressure to. Whatever was building had its own pace, and I'd learned enough by then to trust the pace of things that were actually real. Russell told me over dinner one evening in early autumn that he'd been talking to some former colleagues about forming a small advisory group, high-level operational consulting for companies in growth phases. He wanted me involved. You're not ready to lead it, he said, directly in the way he always was. But you're close. And being in the room while I do it will get you there faster than anything else I can offer. I said yes. He also mentioned, that evening, that he was co-hosting a dinner celebration in November to mark the formalization of the advisory group. Some people I'd want to meet, he said. People in industry, a few investors, some former clients of his who'd become advocates. He wanted me there as a founding member. Bring someone if you want, he said. It'll be at Aurelius. Private room. I went home that night with something that felt like arrival. Not the end point of a journey. Just the clear sense of standing somewhere real. The dinner was on a Thursday evening in November. I arrived at Aurelius, a restaurant in the West Village I'd walked past 100 times and never had occasion to enter, 20 minutes early. Not from anxiety, but from the habit I'd built of arriving in time to orient. The private room in the back was already being set up. Long table, amber light, the kind of understated arrangements that signal someone made decisions rather than expenditures. Stuart came because he was one of the people I most wanted there. Russell was already in conversation with two men I didn't know yet, and he pulled me in immediately and introduced me with the particular warmth of someone who is proud of the thing they're introducing. The room filled. 12 people total. A few of Russell's longtime colleagues, some clients, two people I'd worked with on the fractional engagement, a journalist who covered operations and logistics for a business publication, people who'd built things, people who'd made decisions, people who, I noticed with some surprise, seemed genuinely interested in talking to me. I had a conversation with a woman who ran a supply chain consultancy in Chicago that went 40 minutes before we noticed the time. I talked with one of Russell's colleagues about a model I developed for inventory forecasting that he asked about twice, from different angles, the way people do when they're actually trying to understand something. I felt, for the first time in a long time, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Paula had said she'd try to make it by 9. She had a client call that might run late. I told her no pressure, and meant it. At 8:40, I was standing near the entrance of the private room, refilling my water glass, when I heard a change in the ambient sound of the restaurant. Not dramatic, just a momentary shift, a brief recalibration in the noise of a busy room. I looked up. She was standing in the main restaurant, 8 feet away. Suzanne. She was with someone I didn't recognize, a woman I assumed was a work contact, given the nature of the conversation they'd been having as they came in. A dinner meeting, maybe. Two people scanning for their table. She saw me at the same moment I saw her. The thing about recognition when you weren't expecting it is that the face does the processing before the mind does. I saw her face go through several things in the span of 2 seconds. The initial blankness of what is this? The resolution of that's him. And then the longer, slower recalibration as her eyes moved past me, to the private room lit with amber light, the long table, Russell at the head of it, the people gathered, the journalist, the Chicago consultant, the people she would have recognized, I realized, because they were exactly the kind of people she'd always paid attention to, names she knew from coverage of firms she'd admired, someone she'd once mentioned to me as someone she'd love to be in a room with. She was in that room. Because of me. I watched her understand this. Hi, I said. It came out calm. Not performed calm, just actual. I was genuinely calm. I noticed that with something like surprise. Hi, she said. And then, with the awkward grace of someone improvising, I didn't know you, what is this? A dinner, I said, celebrating the launch of an advisory group I'm part of. She looked at the room again. Her companion had drifted slightly, probably sensing something. I heard you'd been. Neil mentioned you were doing well, she said. I am, I said, not with emphasis, just factually. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable for me. For her, I couldn't tell. She was looking at me differently than she'd ever looked at me, not with longing. I want to be careful about how I tell this, because it wasn't a romantic moment, it wasn't the movies, but with the expression of someone revising. Someone looking at an object they'd assessed and realizing the assessment was conducted under poor conditions. Stuart appeared at my shoulder. He greeted Suzanne by name, with the cordial neutrality of a person who knows more than he'll say. Good to see you, he told her, and his voice was pleasant and final. Suzanne nodded. Her eyes moved back to me. You look well, she said. Thank you, I said. So do you. Another pause. From behind me, Russell's voice. There you are. Come meet Michael. I want you two to talk before dinner starts. I glanced back at him, then back at Suzanne. I should get back, I said. She nodded again. Something was moving across her face. She was working toward words and I could see it. It's really good, she said, finally. What you're doing. It's really good. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about saying something. There were things I could have said, honest things, maybe even kind things. I said, take care of yourself, Suzanne. Then I turned and walked back into the amber-lit room, where 12 people who respected what I'd built were waiting for dinner to begin. She was still there when I looked up 20 minutes later. Her dinner meeting had been seated at a table I could see from the doorway, and I noticed, not with satisfaction, or not only with satisfaction, that she was facing my direction. Not staring, but aware of the room in the way you're aware of something you can't quite stop tracking. Just before the first course, she appeared at the edge of the private room. I excused myself and stepped out. We moved to a quiet section near the bar, one of those narrow standing tables, somewhere between the dining room and the exit, which felt appropriate. I want to say something, she said. Okay. I was wrong about you. She said it plainly, without the hedging that apologies sometimes carry. What I said that night, I was wrong. About what I was looking for. About you. About what matters. I nodded slowly. I was going through something at work that I didn't tell you about, she continued. And I think I was measuring everything against everything else to try to feel better about things. And you were there, and I took it out on you. The comparison thing. Kirk and all of that. I was looking for evidence that I'd chosen wrong so that I could stop being afraid of what was actually going wrong. I looked at her. That's the most honest you've been about that period, I said. Not with bitterness. Just observation. I know. She paused. I didn't know how to be honest then. I was scared. I know, I said. And then, because it was true, what you said hurt for a long time. It took me a while to figure out that it was more about you than about me. She absorbed that. That's fair. We stood there for a moment. Are you happy? She asked. I thought about the question. The table of people behind me. The advisory group. The work that had grown from real effort into real results. The apartment in Carroll Gardens. The morning runs. Stuart, who was probably, right now, telling a story that was making 3 people laugh. Yeah, I said. I am. She looked at me with an expression I could only call uncomplicated grief. The grief of someone who doesn't want anything, who has no request, who simply sees clearly what they chose to put down and can acknowledge, now, that it had value. I'm glad, she said. And I believed her. It was at this moment that I heard Paula's voice. She'd arrived, a little after 9, as she'd thought, and she'd come into the private room and been greeted by Stuart, who liked her, and Russell, who'd met her once before and had the good judgment to recognize her immediately. When I came back into the room, she turned, and the expression she made was the particular expression of someone who's happy to see a specific person, not the general warmth of a social occasion, but the directed warmth of you, specifically. I made it, she said. You made it, I confirmed. I introduced her to the 2 people nearest us, and she slid into the conversation the way she always did, without effort, without performance, just present and real and engaged. The Chicago consultant, within 5 minutes, was telling her about a problem she'd been struggling with, and Paula was already asking the right questions. I stood next to her and felt something settle. Suzanne, I was aware, was still in the restaurant. Whether she could see Paula and me, I didn't know. Whether she drew conclusions, I didn't know. It didn't matter. Not as a choice I was making, genuinely not matching. The room was full of people who'd shown up for something real, and Paula was one of them, and I was one of them, and whatever Suzanne was processing in her private table with her dinner companion was hers now. Not mine to manage or to use or to feel vindicated by. I was no longer oriented toward what she thought. That was the thing that surprised me most. Not the dinner. Not the room. Not the people Suzanne would have wanted to impress. The surprise was how little I needed her to see it. The advisory group formalized in December, and within its first 6 months of operation, I'd led 2 engagements independently. One for a logistics startup in New Jersey, one for a regional retailer trying to scale its distribution model. Russell was present as a resource and a sounding board, and increasingly less present as a supervisor. Which was the point. Stuart and I had dinner every few weeks. He was still Stuart, the same person he'd always been, which was the best thing about him. He'd started seeing someone seriously, a woman named Diane who thought he was hilarious, which he was, and who pushed back on him when he was wrong, which was what he needed. Paula and I stopped being careful about what we were to each other sometime in early spring. Not with a conversation. There was no necessary conversation. There was a Sunday afternoon and a walk in Prospect Park and a way of being together that was so clearly a thing that naming it felt redundant. We named it anyway, eventually, because it was worth saying out loud. She was not a prize. She was not a point scored. She was just a person who was genuinely good, who saw me accurately, who made me better not by demanding it, but by being the kind of person who inclined me toward it. That's the only kind of dynamic I understood anymore. Neil I heard from occasionally. He'd left the city, moved upstate, which suited him. Tamara had launched her own PR firm. By accounts I heard, she was good at it. Suzanne, from what I understood, had rebuilt her professional life with more stability and more honesty than she'd had before. She'd taken on clients she actually believed in rather than clients who would make her look good. She'd moved to a smaller apartment and, by her own account to mutual acquaintances, found it more comfortable than the life she'd been performing. I didn't feel triumphant about any of this. I felt something closer to recognition. That people do most of the right things eventually, when they stop performing for an audience that only exists in their heads. She was doing those things. So was I? We'd just done them separately. The word settle had stopped meaning what it used to mean to me. I'd turned it over enough times to understand that it was a word about fear. The fear of someone who believed that love was about selection pressure, about getting the best available option, about not making a mistake. What I'd come to believe, slowly and without drama, was that the people who use that word, who sort the world into those who are desired and those who are merely acceptable, are people who haven't figured out yet that they're the ones doing the settling. Settling for a life that's about measurement instead of meaning. I wasn't interested in that argument anymore. I'd stopped needing to win it. She looked at me for a moment, that night at Aurelius. Like she wanted to say something more. Like there was a sentence she'd been carrying that she thought she might finally put down. This time, I didn't wait to hear it. I simply turned and walked back into the light. And that was the last time I ever looked back.